A German physician called Theodor Brennan made a life-altering discovery in the remote highlands of Montana Territory during the winter of 1876. 5 generations of intentional inbreeding within a single Irish family were documented in medical papers he discovered inside a rural cabin 23 miles from the closest village. However, that wasn't the most unsettling aspect. The preserved remains of 7 newborns, each with the same abnormalities that made them unworthy of life in the eyes of their own parents, were concealed under floorboards and wrapped in oiled cloth. For more than a century, the Donnelly family had been selectively killing off any kid born with obvious genetic flaws in order to preserve their meticulously crafted facade of normalcy. Everything the medical profession held about family ties, inheritance, and the extent people would go to in order to conceal the sinister secrets of their lineages would be called into question by what Dr. Brennan found next. According to the evidence he found, this was not a singular instance of frontier insanity, but rather a part of a purposeful genetic experiment that had been honed and polished over many generations, spanning 2 continents and almost a century of carefully hidden family customs. Please hit the notification bell and subscribe to our channel before we continue with the tale of the Donnelly family and their horrifying genetic heritage. Additionally, please specify which state or city you are listening from in the comments section. We love to hear from our global mystery-loving community. Your participation enables us to present you with more tales like this one, tales that delve into the most sinister facets of American history. The Donnelly family initially took its twisted turn toward genetic disaster during the cold winter of 1,798 inches, the rolling green hills of County Cork, Ireland, rather than in the harsh wilderness of Montana. This is where the story that Dr. Brennan would later write in his private notebooks began. At the very edge of American civilization, the Montana Territory of 1874 was a place where federal authority existed more in principle than in reality. Only 8,000 people lived in Helena, the territory capital, which was centered on the mining enterprises that had spurred the expansion of the area. Only isolated homesteads, dispersed mining sites, and indigenous groups that were still actively opposing the arrival of white settlers could be found in the surrounding highlands. It was a violent and desperate landscape, where families could go months without anyone questioning them, where the brutal winters frequently claimed lives, and where the territorial government's authority was limited to the distance its dispersed deputies could travel over perilous mountain passes. By 1874, the gold rush that had first attracted people to Montana was starting to fade, leaving behind deserted claims and desperate men who would do everything to survive. Across hundreds of miles of wilderness, supply lines were scant, making even basic supplies costly and hard to come by. Outside Helena, medical treatment was almost non-existent. And even there, it was mostly made up of self-taught frontier doctors and army surgeons who knew only how to set broken bones and treat gunshot wounds. Some settlers were drawn to Montana Territory because of its remoteness and lack of supervision, specifically those who needed to escape civilized society and its bothersome questions. Patrick Donnelly, his wife Bridge, and their 4 surviving children Seamus, 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and baby Declan, at 12, came into this harsh environment. With their belongings meticulously packed in wooden crates that represented affluence beyond the reach of ordinary Irish emigrants, they arrived in Helena in September 1874 on a freight wagon. Although Patrick's hands lacked the calluses that come with farming, he gave the impression that he was a prosperous potato farmer escaping the after-effects of the Irish famine. Instead, he spoke with the refined accent of someone who had attended formal education, and his fingers were stained with ink from a guy used to maintaining records rare privileges for an Irish peasant in that era. Observers saw Bridge Donnelly as a lady who was constantly on the verge of losing her nerves. Prematurely aged and small-boned, she hardly ever spoke louder than a whisper and held her children close with an almost obsessive devotion. Local traders saw that she only used gold coins to pay for supplies, counting each one several times before grudgingly giving it up. There was something haunting about her eyes, as if she had seen tragedies well beyond the usual sufferings of frontier existence. The Territorial Land Office was unaware that the Donnellys had brought intricately fabricated documents from New York stating that they had lived in Brooklyn for 3 years before traveling west. Complete with phony work records and false references, the documents were carefully created to deceive even the most meticulous investigator. They had never actually resided in New York. They had left Ireland right away, following a scandal that rocked their small town to its foundations. The local parish priest's discovery of what he described as an abomination against God and nature among their extended family. Known for keeping his distance from parishioners' personal problems, Father Michael O'Sullivan was so appalled by the Donnelly family's actions that he vowed to excommunicate them right away and expose them to British authorities. Writing his final warning to Patrick Donnelly, the priest's normally steady hand had shaken. "What you have done, in the name of bloodline purity, is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Leave this parish immediately, or I will ensure that every soul in County Cork knows the true nature of your family's abominations." In a region where gold coins were often used by former miners and prospectors, Patrick had paid the territorial government in gold coins for 160 acres of isolated mountain terrain, which did not raise any red flags. Accessible only by a perilous mountain trail that became totally impassable during the coldest winter months, the land was situated in a tiny valley between two steep ridges. The closest water supply, a spring-fed creek, only ran during the short summer months before freezing solid for almost half the year, and the isolation was so total that smoke from their cabin chimney was invisible from any nearby homestead. For a family that desperately needed to hide from the world, the setting was ideal. However, it also brought difficulties that would put even their well-thought-out survival plans to the test. At that altitude, the growing season lasted only 4 months. Therefore, producing adequate food for winter survival required extensive agricultural knowledge. If necessary preparations were not taken, cattle could be killed by the intense cold in a single night. Additionally, many frontier families had been driven to lunacy or suicide by the psychological strain of being completely isolated for 6 months of the year. However, the Donnellys constructed their farmhouse with the efficiency of those who had previously encountered comparable difficulties. Patrick and his sons built a solid log cabin with a sophisticated system of internal partitions that could be closed off in the coldest weather, small windows that reduced heat loss, and thick walls that retained heat. The construction demonstrated a level of building method knowledge above what was often found in the frontier, indicating either prior exposure to harsh climates or expert consultation prior to arrival in Montana. Even seasoned mountain people were amazed by the careful precision with which Bridge and the daughters prepared for their first Montana winter. They cultivated crops specifically chosen for their ability to grow in short seasons and poor soil. Preserved meat, using methods that maximized storage space and minimized spoilage, and set up rationing systems that displayed mathematical precision uncommon for ostensibly uneducated Irish peasants. However, neighbors who came across the Donnellys on supply trips to Helena sometimes pointed out quirks that distinguished them from other frontier families. There were remarkable similarities among the family members that went well beyond typical familial characteristics. An almost uncanny consistency of look was produced by their unusually long fingers, sharp angular features, and light blue eyes. The children's behavior patterns were both sophisticated and unsettling at the same time. For their age, they displayed exceptional intelligence and self-control, but they also displayed a dread, rather than respect for parental authority, a cautiousness around strangers, and a submissiveness to authority. The comments that Territory Postal Carrier Jake Harrison witnessed during his monthly excursions around the mountain communities were the most disturbing. Even in their English-speaking conversations, the family mentioned maintaining the purity of the line, the strength that comes from proper breeding, and the sacrifices necessary for family advancement. These were not the usual concerns of frontier families fighting for their basic survival. The family spoke Irish Gaelic most of the time. They offered more profound and unsettling explanations for their solitary way of existence. When the mountain passages were finally opened by the spring thaw in March 1875, following 6 months of total seclusion, the first indication that something was seriously off with the Donnelly family appeared. Upon arriving to their cabin to deliver government correspondence, his first mail run since October of the previous year, Jake Harrison felt instantly that something horrible had transpired during the protracted winter. There were indications of recent changes to the cabin itself. Fresh chinking filled in the gaps that suggested aggression or conflict. New boards covered what looked like holes in the walls, and despite the frozen ground, there was indications of extensive digging around the building. The stench that filled the entire house was the most unsettling. It was a sickly sweet smell that Harrison knew from his years of frontier experience as the lingering smell of decay and death. He was greeted at the door by Bridge Donnelly. Harrison didn't recognize her at first because of how drastically her appearance changed. Her hands trembled with what seemed to be chronic nervousness, and the lady who had come in Montana only 6 months earlier as a worried but generally healthy frontier wife suddenly appeared haggard and hollow-eyed. Her hair had become prematurely gray at the temples, and her clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost a good deal of weight. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak, like though she hadn't spoken in weeks. She managed to mumble. The winter was difficult, as she anxiously peered inside the cabin's interior. We had complications. With Bridge in active labor and only her teenage daughter Moira there, Harrison discovered the family in the middle of what seemed to be a challenging birth. However, what he saw that March afternoon would ultimately prove to be vital information in figuring out the family's troubled past. The sequence was planned with a clinical accuracy that implied a great deal of prior familiarity with similar circumstances. The resulting baby was obviously deformed. Its head was excessively huge with a prominent sloping forehead that suggested serious developmental problems. Its spine bent in an awkward S-shape, and its left arm ended in a clubbed hand with only 3 fingers. In addition to the obvious abnormalities, the child's breathing was laborious, and its screams had a feeble, mewing tone that signaled internal problems. Harrison was particularly troubled by the family's response to this clearly distressed baby. He saw what he subsequently characterized as cold, calculated assessment in their eyes, instead of the sorrow, worry, or desperate attempts to assist that he expected from parents dealing with such a tragedy. Harrison couldn't comprehend the fast-paced Irish Gaelic that Patrick and Bridge were using as they exchanged meaningful looks. Their tone was one of discussion of established protocols for dealing with a known scenario rather than one of astonishment or agony. "The child won't survive the week," declared Patrick, clinically detached, despite the infant's feeble screams and seemingly robust breathing, which indicated basic vitality. Harrison offered to ride right away to Helena for a doctor, stressing that even severely deformed infants sometimes survived with proper medical care, but Patrick firmly refused, his pale blue eyes hardening with an authority that brooked no argument. "The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate. It's God's mercy, really. Better to take them young than let them suffer. We know how to handle our own troubles," he replied, supporting his wife's shoulder with a protective hand. "It's the Lord's will that some children aren't meant for this world. Interfering with divine judgment would be a sin against nature itself." Harrison found the religious explanation to be well practiced, as though Patrick had given it numerous times previously. His tone also had an undercurrent of threat, implying that anyone who dared to meddle in the family's private management of the matter would face dire repercussions. With faces that indicated no surprise at discovering their mother in labor or their newest sibling visibly deformed, Seamus and little Declan, who had been working outdoors during the birth, returned to the cabin, indicating that this was not the first birth of this kind they had seen. The baby was gone by the time Harrison came 2 weeks later with his usual mail delivery. Bridge red-rimmed but utterly dry eyes, which betrayed someone who had used up all of their grief reserves rather than someone who was grieving a new loss, greeted him at the door. She reported, "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," in an emotionless voice. Harrison felt shivers down his spine as she said, "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way." For the first time, he saw a line of little wooden crosses signifying freshly turned ground behind the hut. 4 graves that were too small for adult burials and with rough dates from the previous 8 months were counted by him. The ramifications were astounding. During their first year in Montana, the Donnellys had lost several infants. but they had never notified territorial authorities of the losses, as required by law. To Harrison's seasoned eye, the burials themselves appeared incorrect. Rather than the meticulous burial of cherished infants, the pattern of disturbed soil implied hurried, frightened labor. The graves were spaced apart to suggest intentional planning rather than random tragedy, and the crosses were all the same size and shape, as if they had been made beforehand rather than individually for each loss. There was room for more burials because they were positioned in a tidy row. Harrison started observing the Donnelly family dynamics closely that summer while he maintained his monthly postal rounds. Over time, his observations shaped a picture of a home functioning under demands and regulations unrelated to ordinary frontier survival. The children moved with the meticulous accuracy of those who understood that errors had dire repercussions, and their interactions with one another revealed communication patterns that implied a shared understanding of family secrets that were too risky to speak in public. Despite only being 17 and 15, Moira and Colleen exuded the wisdom and fatigue of much older ladies. They were more efficient at household chores than the typical adolescent. However, there was something haunting about their gaze, as if they had seen something that had altered their perspective on family dynamics. Their voices held a deference that sounded more like dread than respect when they addressed their parents. The 9-year-old eldest son, Seamus, had a noticeable stammer that seemed to get worse around his father. He avoided making eye contact with anyone outside of his immediate family and winced at abrupt movements. His response to inquiries about family life was the most unsettling. As if recalling the repercussions of disclosing family information, he would start to react normally, then stop and remain mute. Harrison once saw young Declan, who seemed the most typical of the kids, looking at the tiny graveyard behind the hut with fear instead of grief. In response to a question concerning his dead siblings, the boy had said, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." The boy had clapped his hand over his mouth as if he had realized he had said something inappropriate and had not spoken again during Harrison's visit. The discussions Harrison occasionally overheard while sneaking across the woodland to the cabin were the most unsettling. Using Irish expressions Harrison was unable to translate, the family often discussed keeping the line pure, maintaining the strength of the blood, and the sacrifices our ancestors made to preserve what matters. The tone implied rituals or traditions that went well beyond typical family practices. A family functioning according to beliefs and practices that predated their arrival in Montana by many years, possibly generations, was depicted through references to the others back home, what happened to the weak ones, and, most chillingly, which children show the signs, and how to handle the imperfect ones. The remote mountain homestead served as more than just a haven from the outside world. It was a thoughtfully selected spot where the family could carry on customs that would be impossible to uphold in the face of everyday community life. The Donnelly family was once again completely isolated as 1,875 entered its severe winter months. For the second time since they arrived in Montana Territory, the mountain passes were completely closed off from the outside world from November to March due to snow blocking them. However, the actual nature of their genetic heritage started to emerge during this second time of seclusion, shocking even the hardened inhabitants of the frontier and eventually attracting the notice of territorial authorities. The territory physician who would subsequently look into the family, Dr. Theodore Brennan, had come to Helena in October 1875 with medical texts and information that reflected the state-of-the-art in hereditary research. Brennan, a University of Vienna graduate with further studies in Berlin and Edinburgh, had trained under doctors who were only beginning to grasp the workings of genetic inheritance. His medical collection included writings by Francis Galton and other early proponents of the field that would eventually be called genetics, providing him with information that would not be widely accepted in medicine for many years. Brennan had gone to Montana Territory to avoid a professional scandal in Europe, not to go on an adventure or make money. He was a persona non grata in respectable medical circles because of his vocal support for controlled reproduction to better the human species and his research into genetic features, which had led him to findings about human breeding that his colleagues found troubling. He was able to pursue his scholarly pursuits without institutional scrutiny and in anonymity on the frontier. Paradoxically, the same liberty that had drawn the Donnellys for their own unsettling ends. When Jake Harrison showed up to Brennan's Helena office in February of 1875 to 1876, it was the first indication that something was very wrong in the mountain valleys. Harrison, who had ventured out on the perilous winter trail to consult a doctor, claimed to have witnessed strange lights emanating from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours of the night. Smoke patterns that suggested fires were burning at odd temperatures and times, and most unsettling of all noises that reverberated throughout the silent winter nights. "Doctor," Harrison replied with a face wrinkled with concern and disbelief, "I've been carrying mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between normal frontier hardship and something genuinely wrong. What I'm hearing from that cabin in the dead of winter, it's not the sound of people dealing with ordinary troubles. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops so suddenly it's like someone threw a switch. And there's singing, if you can call it that doesn't sound quite human. The melody is wrong, like it's meant for voices that don't work the same way ours do." Harrison's practical frontier senses were also disturbed by visual occurrences he reported. At periods when conserving fuel should have been essential for winter survival, the Donnelly cabin displayed lights glowing. The illumination patterns indicated activities that were inconsistent with typical family routines and required continuous light during the darkest hours of the night. The most unsettling were the times Harrison caught a sight of persons moving outside the cabin during blizzards that should have prevented people from going outdoors. These creatures were abnormally tall or had exceptionally human-like gaits in the shifting snow and shadows. Harrison's descriptions instantly sparked Brennan's medical instincts, but the winter conditions made traveling to the Donnelly homestead completely difficult. Winter emergency visits were usually only required for life-threatening problems that couldn't wait for spring, and even if he could have made it to the chalet. The mountain passes were closed by snow depths that rendered travel suicidal. Harrison had described clear health issues, but the Donnelly family had never sought medical help. Rather than trying a perilous winter voyage, Brennan started scouring territorial archives and Irish immigration records for any information he could find regarding the family's history and past medical conditions. What he found revealed the family's issues went far beyond straightforward frontier hardship and presented a picture of organized deceit that left more questions than answers. In the 1860 seconds and early 1870 seconds, the Donnellys had claimed to be from County Cork, Ireland, and had fled the hardship and crop failures that afflicted rural Irish villages. In-depth accounts of lost family members, ruined farms, and financial situations that compelled them to look for possibilities in America were included in their immigration documents. However, a thorough comparison of their statements with official Irish parish records showed discrepancies that strongly implied complex manipulation. Church baptismal and marriage records, which often offered trustworthy genealogical information, could not be used to confirm the identified relatives in Ireland. The farm locations described did not correspond with County Cork's current land ownership records. The most concerning aspect was that the family's claimed immigration reasons, poverty, and agricultural failures did not align with the substantial sum of gold they had utilized to buy their Montana land, finance their transcontinental journey, and set up their remote homestead. Reports that Brennan discovered hidden in New York immigration files, documents that immigration authorities had reportedly neglected to properly follow up on, were even more alarming. In fact, a family named Donnelly had visited Ellis Island in 1874, but medical inspectors had noted that some of the children had unsettling physical traits that might indicate genetic problems. According to the medical assessment, the parents had become more combative and evasive when asked about their family's medical history, and there were indications of developmental abnormalities that were consistent with genetic problems. Administrative officials eager to process the large number of immigrants passing through Ellis Island every day overruled the recommendation of Dr. Samuel Morrison, the immigration medical inspector, that the family be detained for a prolonged medical evaluation. According to Morrison's notes, he was worried about more than just medical anomalies. He had noticed similarities in the family's behavior that pointed to a practice of hiding information that was important for public safety and health. Brennan found references to Irish family named Donnelly in other American areas when he dug deeper into the documents that were available. These families had come at different dates, but displayed comparable behavioral characteristics. In 1871, the extraordinarily high infant mortality rates of a Donnelly family in Pennsylvania had drawn the attention of local authorities. In 1873, county authorities in Ohio had looked into a different Donnelly family for potential child mistreatment. However, the case was closed when the family abruptly moved without leaving any forwarding information. The pattern implied that rather than being lone criminals, the Montana Donnellys were a part of a wider network of connected families who traveled about a lot to evade government investigation and engaged in similar behaviors. The ramifications were profound. If these were all members of the same extended family, their systematic infanticide and genetic engineering may have been carried out in several states over many years, involving dozens of victims. Brennan's fascination in the Donnelly family's story grew as spring drew near and the mountain passes started to open up. Because of the limited breeding pools, isolated groups frequently develop genetic issues, a well-documented phenomena in remote societies throughout history, according to his professional background. However, there was something about this specific family that pointed to a pattern much more intentional and methodical than mere geographic isolation could account for. Brennan was persuaded that the Donnellys represented something unprecedented in his medical experience, a family that had consciously chosen to pursue genetic experimentation on themselves, regardless of the consequences for their children or the larger community. After combining Harrison's unsettling observations with the suspicious immigration records and the evidence of potential connections to similar families in other states, Dr. Brennan decided to personally visit the Donnelly property in 1876 when the mountain paths were finally reopened by the spring thaw, supposedly to offer standard medical care to a remote frontier household. His knowledge of genetics, human nature, and the extent people will go to in order to protect multi-generational family secrets would all be drastically altered by what he discovered there. It took a whole day of arduous travel over terrain that appeared to have been purposefully designed for its inaccessibility in order to reach the Donnelly cabin. Even seasoned horsemen would have found the trail difficult as it traveled through thick forests, over shaky creek beds, and up steep mountain slopes. Brennan found no other travelers, no indications of other homesteads, and no proof that anybody else had walked the trail for months since the isolation was so total. From the outside, the cabin itself seemed surprisingly normal. It was well built, kept up, and showed evidence of successful animal husbandry and diligent farming, which suggested that the family was adjusting to life on the frontier. The adjacent area displayed signs of diligence and wise land use, including well-kept vegetable gardens, effective animal shelters, and water management systems that revealed advanced agricultural expertise. However, Brennan's medically trained eye picked up on alarming details that most tourists would have missed. A family who claimed to have lost only sporadic infants to the difficult frontier conditions had far too many tombs in the family cemetery behind the cabin. Plots that were obviously too tiny for adult burials were marked by 11 wooden crosses that Brennan counted. The crosses were engraved with dates that indicated deaths occurred at suspiciously regular intervals, rather than the haphazard clustering that is typical of epidemic sickness or severe weather casualties. The neat rows in which the graves were placed showed methodical planning as opposed to frantic reactions to unforeseen disasters. The evidence of recent growth in the cemetery region was more unsettling. New tool marks in the nearby trees and freshly moved dirt indicated that other grave sites were being prepared ahead of time, indicating that the family anticipated more deaths rather than wishing to prevent them. The crosses, identifying already existing graves, displayed comparable weathering and construction patterns, suggesting that they were manufactured in large quantities rather than one at a time for every kid who passed away. At the cabin door, Patrick Donnelly greeted him with a blend of frontier warmth and hardly disguised fatigue that instantly roused Brennan's business instincts. The patriarch of the family was much older than Harrison had described him the year before. Even though he appeared to be 45, his hair had become entirely white, and his face was wrinkled with deep lines that showed persistent stress rather than natural aging. His eyes had a haunting aspect Brennan recognized in patients with serious psychological trauma, and his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Patrick stated, "We don't need a doctor here. with a stern tone. His words conveyed conviction, but his voice did not. "We've always handled our own troubles, just as our families did in the old country. Bringing outsiders into family matters only complicates situations that are better resolved through traditional methods." Brennan was astounded by Brid's physical decline from Harrison's earlier statements as she emerged behind her husband. A little more than a year after giving birth, the mother now appeared thin and hollow-eyed. She had such a tiny build that her clothes hung over her exposed bones like drapes. A persistent tremor in her hands might have been a sign of neurological issues, long-term malnourishment, or psychological stress that was severe enough to manifest physically. With a scathing gaze that suggested years of skilled dominance and punishments for disobedience that went beyond typical marital power, Patrick silenced her when she tried to speak. However, the most unsettling proof of the family's sinister secrets and strange way of life came from the kids. Now 18, Moira was obviously pregnant once more. Her health had deteriorated to the point where it seemed likely that she conceived during the remote winter months, when no strangers could have been around. Brennan found the questions highlighted by this time, the family's isolation, and the peculiar genetic patterns to be both personally and professionally upsetting. Colleen, who is now 16, displayed physical development that appeared to be ahead of schedule for her age. Her completely developed adult characteristics suggested hormonal imbalances, which could be caused by environmental or genetic reasons. Her actions toward her parents were more concerning. Her submissiveness and maturity suggested experiences that were unsuitable for a person of her age. The most unsettling was Declan, a 13-year-old boy who had grown much out of shape during Harrison's earlier visits. With one side of his face looking normally formed and the other displaying evidence of deformity or halted growth, the boy's facial characteristics were obviously asymmetrical. In addition to his hands displaying the long fingers and odd joint flexibility Brennan identified as potential signs of inherited connective tissue problems, he walked with a noticeable limp that implied spine curvature. Throughout his brief first visit, Brennan noted family dynamics that went against accepted social norms and implied psychological stresses that extended well beyond the challenges of the frontier. The fear and resignation with which the older children surrendered to their parents suggested that the penalties for non-compliance were significantly worse than those typically meted out by parents. As though they had learned from experience that impulsive activity could result in harmful and unpredictable reactions, their motions were deliberate and cautious. The 20-year-old eldest son, Seamus, avoided making eye contact with the visiting physician and his parents. During Brennan's visit, he appeared to be struggling inside and was clearly disturbed due to his severe stutter, which had gotten worse to the point that he could not speak. As if recalling serious repercussions for disclosing family information to strangers, Seamus would start to answer normally when confronted with direct queries about his personal health or family life, then stop in the middle of his statement and go silent. Brennan also thought the family's living situation was unusual for a frontier family. With thick curtains and closed doors that appeared to be intended to hide activities rather than merely arrange family life, the cabin's interior was partitioned into more distinct areas than were required for seclusion alone. There were odors that suggested methods beyond standard frontier medical or food preservation, as well as sounds from other areas of the cabin that suggested ongoing activities that the family didn't want their guests to witness. These aromas were organic, medicinal, and slightly unsettling. After his initial evaluation, Brennan was about to leave when Patrick drew him aside with a sense of urgency that verged on desperation. His demeanor revealed a man juggling conflicting needs, keeping family secrets, and getting assistance for issues that had gotten out of hand. "Doctor," Patrick muttered, looking anxiously toward the cabin to make sure no family members were listening. "If I were to tell you that sometimes God tests families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand what I mean? Would you be able to help without asking questions that might bring trouble to people who are already suffering?" Patrick went on, growing more agitated, before Brennan could come up with a reply. "Our bloodline carries great strength, but it also carries complications. We've learned to manage these complications through methods that our fathers and grandfathers developed over many generations. These methods have worked for us in the old country, but here in Montana, people ask different kinds of questions. They expect things that we cannot provide without revealing practices that wouldn't be understood by those who don't share our particular burdens. Brennan's professional poise was shaken by the implications of Patrick's well-crafted confession. He was starting to realize that the Donnelly family's seclusion went beyond simply evading criticism for their odd behavior. It was about concealing systematic methods that had been honed and mastered over many centuries before being introduced to the American wilderness, practices that would appall even the rough-and-tumble society of the frontier. Jake Harrison sent Dr. Brennan an urgent note 2 months after his first visit, forcing him to face the full horror of the Donnelly family's genetic inheritance. A few hurriedly scribbled words made up the message, which was given by a local trapper who had ventured out on the perilous mountain trail. Donnelly woman in bad labor. Family asking for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick if you can. The Donnelly family was seeking outside medical help for the first time since they arrived in Montana Territory, which was a significant change from their earlier insistence on keeping all family affairs private. The fact that they had broken through their compulsive secrecy to seek assistance indicated that the problems were so serious that not even their vast knowledge of challenging deliveries could solve them. On a hot July afternoon, Brennan arrived at the mountain cabin to discover a scene that would recur in his nightmares for decades to come. The remote valley had become a furnace due to the intense heat, and even healthy people found it difficult to breathe due to the high humidity in the air. Even more oppressive was the atmosphere inside the cabin, which was thick with the smells of blood, perspiration, and something else. A sickly sweet smell that Brennan couldn't immediately recognize, but that made him realize something was seriously amiss. In the rear room of the hut, Moira Donnelly lay, her labor exacerbated by elements that Brennan's trained eye could see right away. The twins the young woman was giving birth to weren't your typical multiple births. In an era before sophisticated medical intervention, Brennan was aware that the infants were conjoined at the torso and seemed to share major internal organs, a condition that was nearly always deadly. The family's response to this clearly disastrous development, however, astounded him more than the medical complexity of the issue. The Donnellys responded with a cold, calculated demeanor that showed they had dealt with similar situations many times before, rather than the panic, sadness, and desperate desire for divine intervention that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy. Bridge and Patrick collaborated with the effectiveness of individuals adhering to a set procedure. Their moves were deliberate and well-coordinated rather than haphazard. Seamus and Colleen set up supplies and equipment that were obviously meant for handling a crisis that needed quick, decisive action rather than for celebrating a birth. Even the most advanced medical facilities of the day would have been overburdened by the twins' medical needs. In addition to having exterior tissue connections, they seem to have integrated neurological and cardiovascular systems, which, with the advancement of medical technology in 1876, made separation impossible. Despite the fact that one baby was obviously stronger than the other, both displayed vitality indicators that indicated they would live for days or even weeks with the right supportive care. "Doctor," Patrick stated with a clinical coldness that made Brennan's blood shiver, "we need you to tell us honestly whether they can be separated, whether there's any medical procedure that might allow one of them to survive as a normal child." Brennan spotted something that chilled him as he started to examine the conjoined twins. Underneath the birthing bed were leather-bound journals that had meticulous notes and drawings of similar births spanning what seemed like decades. Careful anatomical drawings of infants with a variety of deformities were displayed on page after page, including cleft palates, missing limbs, spinal anomalies, extra digits, and conditions Brennan had never seen depicted with such clinical accuracy. Each drawing had dated entries that covered several decades in various geographical areas, along with remarks in both English and Irish Gaelic. Using language that implied medical knowledge far beyond what would be expected of normal frontier households, some records contained thorough details of corrective actions taken to address these genetic issues. Over the course of more than 50 years, the family's moves around Ireland and America were traced by the dates and places of the recorded births. The most unsettling were the thorough anatomical analyses that were included with every birth certificate. The clinical language could not mask the fact that these records documented systematic evaluation of newborn infants for traits that the family deemed acceptable or unacceptable for survival. The illustrations depicted not only the external deformities, but also speculative internal anatomy, potential survival prospects, and what the notes euphemistically called quality of life assessments. For the first time since his arrival, Bridge spoke, her voice bearing the burden of generations of awful knowledge after noticing his finding. The bloodline must be kept pure, Doctor. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread and contaminate future generations. Our families learned this truth through hard experience over many generations back in the old country. What looks like cruelty to outsiders is actually mercy, both for the children who would suffer and for the family line that must be preserved. She spoke with the conviction of someone reciting a core religious principle. However, the philosophy she outlined included human breeding principles that went against all of the medical ethics and human decency standards Brennan had been taught in his professional training. Infanticide wasn't the only thing the Donnelly family was doing. They were employing the concepts of selective breeding, which viewed humans as livestock that could be improved by carefully weeding out unwanted features, to do systematic genetic experiments on their own offspring. Additional evidence that exposed the full extent of the family's genetic manipulation was found in the leather notebooks. Genealogical charts that traced the Donnelly genealogy over several generations were concealed among the medical data. These charts revealed patterns of intermarriage between closely related family members, which helped to explain why their children had a high frequency of genetic disorders. In addition to being husband and wife, the charts showed that Patrick and Bridge were first cousins, carrying on a tradition of intentional inbreeding that began with 5 generations of meticulously arranged marriages intended to concentrate what the family considered to be superior genetic traits. According to genealogical records, the practice started in Ireland in the early 1800s when Patrick's great-grandfather was convinced that selective breeding, akin to agricultural methods used to produce superior animals, could improve the Irish people. The family had used a perverted interpretation of biblical genealogies and pseudoscientific beliefs of racial superiority that had become fashionable among some educated elites in Europe at the time to defend their systematic inbreeding. Brennan knew he was seeing the result of a genetic experiment that had been carried out over several generations, with little regard for the agony it caused as he kept analyzing the twins and looking through the family's medical records. The conjoined babies, gasping for air in their makeshift cradle, were not a chance accident. Rather, they were the inevitable outcome of decades of methodical genetic engineering that had ultimately resulted in deformities too severe to be concealed or explained away. The terror in the Montana highlands becomes worse just when we think we've seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who liked dark mysteries. If this narrative is making you shiver, please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's explore what comes next in this unsettling story of family secrets and genetic modification that spans generations of purposeful human experimentation. The conjoined twins' imminent predicament compelled Brennan to make choices that would plague him for the remainder of his professional life. The babies were obviously in pain. Their breathing was hard and erratic, and their common cardiovascular system was straining to sustain 2 distinct bodies. With the rudimentary equipment available in the remote mountain chalet, medical intervention was difficult. However, letting them suffer without trying to find a solution went against every medical ethics concept Brennan had vowed to follow. The extent of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulation became horrifyingly evident as Dr. Brennan worked through the night to examine the secret journals while the conjoined twins battled for their lives. The records revealed a thorough program of human experimentation that had been carried out with scientific accuracy for more than a century, in addition to 5 generations of systematic infanticide and selective breeding. The earliest entries, in archaic Irish script and faded brown ink, explained how Fergus Donnelly, the first Donnelly patriarch, had started the practice in County Cork In the 1,790 seconds after seeking advice from learned men who understood the science of bloodlines and the improvement of human stock, according to the journal. According to these early entries, Fergus had been influenced by agricultural breeding theories that were gaining traction among the era's progressive farmers, men who had accomplished remarkable success in creating superior breeds of sheep, horses, and cattle through controlled mating and careful selection. The degraded peasant stock, which Fergus believed had been weakened by centuries of British oppression and poverty, would be inferior in intelligence, physical prowess, and moral character to what he called a perfected Irish bloodline, created by applying the same principles to human reproduction. He first experimented with marrying his own children to their first cousins, a practice he justified by closely examining scriptural genealogies that appeared to encourage tight intermarriage within family groups. Fergus's theories had appeared to be supported by the initial findings. The family viewed the first generation of purposefully inbred children's exceptional intelligence, remarkable physical attractiveness, and other traits as proof of genetic supremacy. However, the records also showed that births of horribly malformed infants had occurred even in the first generation, and that they were discreetly removed by what the journal euphemistically referred to as merciful release from earthly suffering. Genetic experimentation grew more methodical and scientifically advanced as the centuries went by. By implementing new selection criteria and creating more complex explanations for rejecting offspring who did not fit the family's changing standards of genetic acceptability, each succeeding patriarch had improved the breeding program. The journals included thorough explanations of characteristics that were deemed desirable, such as angular facial features, unusual height, mathematical aptitude, and pale blue eyes, as well as characteristics that needed to be immediately eliminated, such as mental retardation, physical deformities, and what the family referred to as behavioral irregularities. The most unsettling discovery, however, was made by Brennan when he came across a portion of the book devoted to what was known as the Enhancement Protocol. The notes detailed methodical efforts to hasten the concentration of desired features through progressively closer breeding links. This strategy culminated in Patrick's generation, where he and Bridge were not only first cousins, but also the offspring of 4 prior generations of intentional inbreeding, aimed at maximizing the expression of what the family deemed to be superior genetic traits. In several ways, the protocol had produced the desired outcomes. In contrast to other frontier families, the surviving members of the Donnelly family did exhibit exceptional intelligence, extraordinary physical homogeneity, and specific abilities. However, the genetic toll had been disastrous. The family's genetic experiment had reached a crisis point that threatened their survival as a viable breeding population, as evidenced by the high frequency of severe birth defects, the evident mental health issues affecting the older children, and the parents' gradual decline. When Brennan presented him with the journal evidence, Patrick admitted, "My great-grandfather thought he was creating a superior race. He studied the breeding methods used by the finest horse and cattle breeders in Ireland, men who had created animals of exceptional quality through sows, careful selection, and controlled mating. He believed that the Irish people had been degraded by centuries of poverty and oppression, and that only through deliberate improvement of our bloodlines could we reclaim our rightful position as a superior people." As he went on, Patrick's voice was a mix of pride and mounting skepticism. "For 4 generations, the method seemed to work. Our family produced children of exceptional intelligence and beauty, men and women who could have been leaders and innovators if the world had been ready to recognize our superiority. But the cost has been terrible. So many children born wrong, so many who had to be released from lives that would have brought nothing but suffering to themselves and shame to the family line." The family's eugenic ideals were a great cry from the genetic realities Brennan understood from his sophisticated medical study. Selective breeding had not improved and purified the Donnelly bloodline. Through the accumulation of recessive genetic features that resulted in progressively more severe deformities with each generation, it had been methodically exterminated. A downward spiral of genetic degradation that could only result in the total extinction of the family line was created by the children who lived to adulthood, carrying hidden genetic harm that would unavoidably manifest in their own progeny. The conjoined twins, gasping for air in their makeshift cradle, symbolized the Donnelly genetic experiment's final failure. Deliberate inbreeding for 5 generations had not produced superior humans. A community that was growing less accepting of isolated family activities that went against recognized moral and legal norms had become suspicious of the more severe defects it had caused, which could no longer be concealed, explained, or eradicated. Brennan realized he was witnessing the culmination of America's first systematic experiment in human eugenics as he watched Patrick and Bridge get ready to carry out what they obviously saw as another necessary elimination of genetically unacceptable offspring. This experiment had been carried out covertly for more than a century, leaving a trail of murdered infants and psychologically damaged family members across 2 continents. The immediate conflict over the conjoined twins' fate turned into a struggle for the soul of a family that had lost all human decency in their quest for genetic perfection that only existed in their own warped imagination, rather than just for the lives of 2 suffering infants. The Donnelly family's century-long genetic experiment came to an end when they confronted Dr. Brennan about what would happen to the conjoined twins. This marked the start of a reckoning that would reveal one of the darkest chapters at the nexus of family secrets, rudimentary genetic science, and the American frontier's tolerance for remote communities functioning outside the purview of civilized oversight. The Donnellys were forced to admit that their remote practices could no longer be maintained in an increasingly interconnected American society where suspicious family dynamics and unusual infant mortality rates would unavoidably attract official attention that could no longer be avoided through geographic isolation alone. Brennan's intervention was supported by his authority as territorial physician and his explicit threat to involve federal marshals if the family harmed the twins. Despite Brennan's best attempts to give supportive care using the rudimentary medical equipment available in the isolated mountain lodge, the twins only lived for 3 days. They passed away peacefully in the early hours of Brennan's 3rd day at the property after their shared cardiovascular system failed to support life. However, their brief existence was the last indisputable evidence of the disastrous results of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulation results that could no longer be concealed from the public or explained by increasingly flimsy religious arguments that had been made with every generation of systematic inbreeding. Brennan's legal authority to thoroughly investigate the family's medical history and practices was granted by the twins' deaths. His investigation of the 11 tiny graves behind the cabin, along with a thorough review of the family's medical journals and genealogical documents, demonstrated evidence of systematic infanticide that spanned several generations and involved at least 23 recorded cases of children who had been removed due to a variety of genetic flaws, from obvious physical abnormalities to undesirable behavioral traits. The full scope of their family history and the systematic genetic testing that had consumed 5 generations of his ancestry was ultimately disclosed by Patrick Donnelly in the face of overwhelming evidence and the prospect of murder, charges that may lead to execution under territorial law. Using selective breeding methods borrowed from agricultural animal husbandry, his great-grandfather Fergus had developed an obsession with producing what he called a perfect Irish bloodline in Ireland in the early 1800s, which is when the practice started. The family had used a mix of social Darwinist ideas that were becoming more and more popular among some educated classes in the middle of the 19th century. Twisted religious interpretations that depicted genetic defects as divine punishment for racial impurity, and pseudo-scientific theories about human improvement to defend their actions. They had persuaded themselves that removing faulty children was not murder, but rather a kind of genetic stewardship that would eventually result in humans who were better than the rotten hordes of mere mortals. For each member of the family, the psychological effects of upholding these beliefs and customs across several generations had been disastrous. As the genetic repercussions of inbreeding became unavoidable, Patrick's own chronic anxiety and despair significantly deteriorated. In addition to having several emotional breakdowns, Bridge displayed symptoms of what Brennan identified as severe post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by years of taking part in the methodical killing of her own children. The surviving children displayed a catastrophic range of physical and psychological injuries brought on by their upbringing in a harsh setting as well as genetic causes. When asked about his involvement in the family's customs, the eldest son Seamus had a total mental breakdown and admitted that he had been made to take part in the removal of flawed siblings since he was 12 years old. He was suffering from such serious psychological trauma that Brennan questioned whether he would ever recover enough to function in normal society, as evidenced by his extreme stutter and inability to sustain eye contact. Due to the family's systematic inbreeding, Moira and Colleen both displayed medical and psychological problems that would take years to resolve. In addition to displaying signs of sexual abuse that indicated their father had been preparing them for marriages to their own brothers, the logical continuation of the family's genetic concentration program, both young women had been psychologically conditioned to accept their roles as breeding stock for carrying on the family line. The most difficult problem for territory authorities was young Declan, whose physical abnormalities made him a daily reminder of the family's hereditary shortcomings. He would need continuous medical care for his developing spinal curvature and facial asymmetry, but his psychological state had been so ruined by years of torture and infanticide that he was a risk to himself and others. One night, the youngster left territorial custody and vanished into the Montana wilderness, leaving no evidence that would help officials figure out what happened to him. The unusual nature of Patrick and Bridge Donnellys' crimes and the territorial court system's inexperience, with instances involving systematic genetic research and hereditary cycles of infanticide, hindered the judicial processes against them. While defense lawyers tried to claim that the defendants were victims of inherited mental illness rather than cunning criminals who had systematically murdered their own children, the territorial prosecutor found it difficult to find suitable charges for crimes that had occurred across several generations and jurisdictions. Experts in medicine and law from all over the American territories took notice of the case. However, a large portion of the testimony and evidence never made it to the general public due to the distant location and antiquated communication systems of the time. Both Patrick and Bridge Donnelly passed away in territorial custody before their cases could go to trial. Bridge from complications related to her last pregnancy, which resulted in yet another severely malformed stillbirth that seemed to symbolize the ultimate futility of the family's genetic experimentation, and Patrick from what appeared to be a stroke caused by the psychological stress of having his life's work exposed as a catastrophic failure. Early medical literature on the risks of consanguineous marriage and the genetic effects of systematic inbreeding included Dr. Brennan's thorough account of the case. Some of the earliest systematic evidence of the link between close familial intermarriage and higher rates of genetic defects in kids was presented in his professional reports, which were initially published in territory medical journals and then in national medical publications. The full extent of his findings, including the systematic infanticide and psychological abuse that had defined the Donnelly family's activities, were never publicized, though. After his death in 1923, Brennan's private notebooks were found, revealing his lifelong struggle to comprehend how people could systematically kill their own children in an attempt to achieve genetic purity that only existed in their own warped mind. His notes detailed ongoing regret at his failure to save the slain children before his intervention could save them, as well as recurrent nightmares about the conjoined twins. After the family was arrested, the Donnelly farmhouse was abandoned, and since no living relatives could be found to assert their right to inherit, the mountain land returned to territorial control. In addition to rising awareness of the horrors that had occurred there, locals shunned the area, in part because of practical worries about the harsh winter circumstances that had drawn the family to the area. An unofficial monument to the perils of genetic testing carried out without ethical oversight or scientific understanding was created, and the remoteness that had once shielded the family's secrets now acted as a natural barrier to keep interested tourists away. A persistent reminder of the ultimate failure of humanity's first systematic experiment in genetic eugenics was the little cemetery behind the cottage, which contained 11 documented graves and signs of additional unmarked burial places. Theories that prioritized genetic purity over parental love and fundamental human decency were morally bankrupt, as evidenced by the tidy rows of crosses indicating the graves of killed newborns. Similar cases started to surface in other remote American areas in the decades after the Donnelly family's actions were made public, indicating that the Montana family had not been the only one to experiment with human breeding methods. Changes in attitudes regarding marriage laws, child protection, and the necessity of government supervision of remote communities that may be engaging in practices detrimental to their members or to society at large were influenced by the mounting evidence regarding the genetic and psychological effects of systematic inbreeding. Beyond their own sad tale, the Donnelly family's genetic experiment left a lasting effect. Their systematic infanticide practices helped shape the legal and ethical standards for child protection that would ultimately render such family-based eugenics programs unsustainable in American society. While their case offered early evidence for genetic theories that would later become central to modern understanding of heredity, this enigma demonstrates how isolation, despair, a basic misinterpretation of human value and scientific principles, and the quest for genetic perfection can result in unspeakable catastrophes. One of the worst periods in the history of the American frontier's tolerance for societies that function beyond the bounds of civilized moral standards, family secrets, and rudimentary genetic research is the Donnelly family's century-long experiment in selective breeding. Their tale serves as a constant reminder of the perils of using people as test subjects in the name of theoretical advancements that only exist in the imaginations of individuals who have lost all sense of parental love and fundamental human decency. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think all the information regarding the Donnelly family's activities was made public? Or might it be that other remote families brought similar, sinister customs to the American frontier? Would authorities without the means and communication capabilities to adequately monitor isolated tribes have been able to detect such systematic genetic experiments in other remote locations? Tell us what you think of this troubling period in American history in the comments section below. If you like this story and would want to see more horror stories like it, please subscribe, click the notification bell, and tell someone you know who enjoys mysteries that make us wonder about human nature and the extent people would go to in order to fulfill their perverted ideal of genetic perfection. I'll see you in the upcoming video.